Hey guys, it's been a while, but I'm finally back with another video. Today I've got a hand history review of one of my favorite hands that I've played, and yes, spoiler alert, as the title suggests, I do end up hero calling the river. I also really like this hand because it shows the power of being able to think on your feet. I feel like nowadays everyone's obsessed with perfecting their solver lines, but I think one of the most important skills you can have as a poker player is figuring out what mistakes your opponent may be making with their range construction and calculating what you should do to exploit it in real time. Now, I won't be referencing any solver solutions in this analysis, but I'm going to try my best at using solver logic to figure out what to do at each decision point. So let's get into the hand history. So this hand was played at 500 NL, and the action folds to the cutoff, who opens for 2.2x. The button calls, and I call pocket nines from the big blind. You could 3-bet or call. I think either option is fine. I don't have much info on the other two players, but I'm assuming they're regs. The flop comes 8-8-4 two-tone, and the action checks over to the button, who stabs for around a third of the pot. So, given that it's a multi-way pot, we're already entering street poker territory because nobody really knows what they're doing in multi-way pots, and I personally have barely studied multi-way sims, and I'm not even sure if the solutions I looked at were even that accurate. Anyways, let's try and figure out what each player wants to do on the flop. So obviously I'm going to check my entire range, but what about the cutoff? Well, I think it's very reasonable for the cutoff to check their entire range too, since if it was a heads up pot between the cutoff and the button, they would want to play a high frequency check, and the fact that we're multi-way doesn't really change that. Now, when it checks over to the button, I think it makes a lot of sense for them to stab for a small sizing. Their range is likely the strongest equity-wise between the three players, as it's condensed around having many pocket pairs and not much air, and getting protection from folding out overcards from the other two players gives them a good incentive to bet. So I think in equilibrium, I'd expect to see the button betting at a pretty high frequency with their pairs plus and also draws and random overcards with backdoors, etc. Now with the action on me, I'm not folding, but the question is, should I raise or call? And answering this question requires me to figure out how I'm playing my entire range on this flop. And let's remember, I not only need to worry about the button, but also the cutoff having a potentially strong hand as well. So the button's bet size is 1/3. And if we looked at this situation from an MDF perspective, the cutoff and I combined can only fold around 25% of the time, meaning on average we individually get to fold around 50% of our range. So this bet is already kind of big. It's equivalent to facing a pot size bet in a heads up pot. Now in practice, we should fold more than this because the button has a range advantage against me and the cutoff, and given my range is weaker than the cutoffs, and they're still left to act behind me, and I'm out of position, I should fold even more and let the cutoff do most of the defending versus the button stab. I don't think it would be that crazy if I folded like 70% of my range here. Now, whenever you're out of position and you need to drastically overfold compared to MDF, it's generally a decent idea to respond by mainly raising. And this flop texture is pretty good for raising since it's valuable to fold out overcards. So I think as a big blind, playing a raise only strategy when continuing is pretty good since we need a good quality hand to continue anyways. We may as well raise to kick the cutoff out to get that sweep protection. And also it's probably an easier strategy to execute since we're uncapped and we don't need to balance a calling range as well. So our raising range here is mainly going to be pretty mergy. We're not going to be raising trips only. We're going to be raising trips and some pairs and some flush draws and some straight draws as well. So I think a small check raise size is appropriate because we're raising merged, and the cutoff ends up folding and the button calls and we see the 8 of spades turn. So once a button calls our check raise, I think their range is going to be pretty similar to ours. It's probably a bit more weighted to pocket pairs, while ours is going to have a relatively higher proportion of trips and also draws. So when the turn repeat 8 comes, I think it's a pretty bad turn card for our range since we have a lot fewer combos of 8x and our draws didn't improve and are also just drawing dead versus a boat, which the button likely has. So we're going to have to play pretty passively here with our range. So I think checking is pretty decent And when the button stabs small again, we're just going to have to check fold almost all of our flush and straight draws. But when we have pocket nines, I think we're actually quite ahead of the button's betting range since we beat all the lower pairs, and we're not that scared of running into tens plus since they would have 3-bet pre-flop. We're only really scared of running into quads, so I think raising again is a pretty decent play. Now, I will admit that I'm probably under bluffing here, since I probably need to turn a hand like 10-9 into a bluff, which is really difficult to find, but oh well. The button calls, and now the hand gets interesting as the river brings in another 8. And I remember the first thought that came to my mind when the river came out was, man, probably going to end up hero calling 9 high. That was my gut feeling, because I knew I was going to check, and if I faced a bet, well, what value is the button really repping? Anyway, I check, and the button goes all in. So if you're playing on autopilot, you might just go, or whatever, I can't call 9 high, so I'm just going to fold. But if you're tuned into what the button's actual range looks like, this jam is really suspicious, because does the button really show up to the river with a hand like ace 10 of clubs or ace jack of clubs? They already would mostly 3-bet pre-flop, and even if they didn't, would they even call a turn check raise when they're only drawing to overcards? I don't know. They could have ace-4 suited, but again, I think this combo mainly 3-bets pre-flop. And even if they had the odd combo of pocket 10s or pocket jacks, would they really jam for value? You got to be pretty crazy to do that. So even if they can show up with value here, in my opinion, it's a really narrow range. Meanwhile, it's so easy to turn a hand like pocket 5s or pocket 6s into a bluff because you have no showdown value. And they're way more likely to have these in full combos by the river because they're a lot less likely to be 3-bet preflop. So it's really easy to start over bluffing given the button needs to have 2 value combos for every 1 bluff combo with a pot size shove. And in this spot, I don't know if they even have 2 full combos of value here. So during the hand, I remember being in the tank, but my mind was already made up to call regardless of what I thought a solver would do, because this jam just smelled like a bluff, and whenever in doubt, I tend to follow my nose. So I end up making the call, and we find the pocket 5s turned into a bluff, which was very, very satisfying. Thanks for watching, guys.